A lot of people have read this book. This book over the last year has been a topic of constant conversation, intelligent and not so intelligent ones across the world. But there are a lot of people who have not read this book. And I hate to do this to the author of a book which is a result, as I can see, of multiple research papers. For those who have not read the book, in 5 to 7 minutes, what's the Cliff Note version of this? What's the long summary?
Well, the book came out of conversations that I was having with my co-author, Sergei Guriev, initially about how the regime in Russia was evolving in the 2000s and the 2010s. We saw in Russia a kind of authoritarian regime emerging that struck us at that time as rather different from the stereotypical authoritarian regime of the 20th century. So in the 20th century, dictators tended to be very violent. They would imprison large numbers of political opponents. They would often kill large numbers of dissidents, political opponents. And clearly, a big part of the strategy for maintaining control was to spread fear. We saw in the early Putin, not I have to say the late Putin, but in the early Putin, a model of social control, which was clearly not at all democratic, but at the same time was rather different from the model of, say, Stalin or Mao or even Latin American dictators like Pinochet or the junta in Argentina, and also different from the kind of dictatorship that we had seen in the 20th century in Africa under Mobutu or Idi Amin. So it struck us that there was potentially something new there, or at least a different kind becoming more prevalent. And looking around the world, we saw a lot of similarities between what Putin was doing, the techniques he was using, and the way that leaders such as Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Erdogan in Turkey, Viktor Orban in Hungary were maintaining control in an ostensibly democratic set of institutions, but in fact, reducing all the democratic elements to practically or completely nothing. So we started thinking about how to characterize this model and how to measure it. So there were a few key elements of this new model. One was that instead of trying to spread fear, these political leaders tried to maintain actual, genuine support on the part of the public by distorting information flows, by usually covertly censoring or maintaining control of the media. They would allow a small independent media to exist, to create the appearance of genuine democracy, but they would make sure that it had very limited appeal, very limited audience. So they would control and manipulate the media space. They would not put large numbers of people in jail because that would very visibly suggest that they were authoritarian. They would hold elections, but behind the scenes, rig them if necessary, and even sometimes if not, just to ensure that everything ran as smoothly as they desired. They would not use ideology in the way that it was often used by authoritarians in the 20th century, that is, an official ideology that was imposed on everybody. Often there was an element of nationalism, but in a way that ostensibly was compatible with the democratic government. They would basically try to maintain high political ratings. So they would justify their rule on the grounds that they were popular, but this popularity was artificially sustained in the sense that real political opponents were not allowed to emerge. They were not allowed to get coverage in the media and in elections. Various tricks were used to make sure, or regulations were used to make sure that genuine threats to the governing group did not succeed, or did not even get onto the ballot. So we saw that model of authoritarian rule in a variety of places. We came up with a way to measure or to distinguish empirically between that type of regime, which we call a spin dictatorship or an informational autocracy, and the type of dictatorship which we think was characteristic of the 20th century, which we call a fear dictatorship. And we found when we collected data and looked at the numbers that the prevalence of spin dictatorship had risen dramatically in recent decades. So from about 1970 to about 2010, the prevalence of spin dictatorships, they'd gone up from about 10% of non-democratic regimes to more than 50%. So that's the basic point that we make in the book. And then we try to understand why this is happening. I should say that when a spin dictatorship emerges, there's no guarantee that it remains a spin dictatorship. There are cases, some very much in the news, like that in Russia under Putin, in which a dictator in power basically changes the model through which he governs. So in the case of Putin, we see him as having been a spin dictator originally, or after basically taking predominantly democratic institutions and turning them into an artificial pseudo-democracy, than a spin dictatorship. He has now, more recently, especially since the war in Ukraine, but even starting earlier, reverted to fear dictatorship. So now in Russia, we see a very open attempt to intimidate any potential opposition. In fact, all overt opposition has been either forced out of the country or people have been jailed on pretexts. He's closed down the previous small independent media, essentially. So any independent media has to be outside the country. And the rhetoric has changed from one focused on convincing people that the government was doing a very professional job, emphasizing that the leader was a Democrat, competent, basically benevolent, caring about the citizens, to a rhetoric that really emphasizes the dangers facing Russia, the hostile external environment, the need for loyalty, and attacking traitors and even critics of the government as being disloyal. So we've seen that change in Russia. We've seen something similar happen in some other cases, like in Venezuela, where Maduro now is using much more overt violence and fear than Chavez did before him. But still, we see a lot of these regimes of the spin dictator type. Some new ones have been emerging even since we wrote. So in Serbia, we see the regime of Aleksandar Vučić as becoming essentially a spin dictatorship, although it's not clear how long-term and stable that will prove. It's possible still, we think, in Serbia for the regime to be replaced through democratic mechanisms. So that's the short version of the book. We see this trend towards a more manipulative, deceptive, less violent model of dictatorship, which pretends to be democratic, rather as opposed to the previous more overtly violent, ideological, sometimes almost totalitarian, or actually totalitarian form of authoritarian governance.
Thank you, Professor. For everybody who just heard this, is part of this right now, and is going to get to it later, the book has many more anecdotes, data points, and visualization. So definitely get a copy and do read it. Professor Treisman, one of the things that jumps up when you read the book, because the first person that kind of you used as a case study, and then the case study then is, you go on to prove that this model has been used time in and time out, is Lee Kuan Yew. And I would agree to a certain extent, but just to clarify this further, would you still consider the Lee Kuan Yew model as spin dictatorship or quasi-democracy?
I'm not quite sure what quasi-democracy means. There comes a point when a democracy is no longer a democracy if it doesn't permit for the turnover in government. So I do consider the Singapore model to be probably the original model, the original modern example of informational autocracy or spin dictatorship, and the most successful, and the one that many, as we discuss in the book, many other authoritarian leaders have sought to imitate.
But not.
So why do we think that? Well, the PAP in Singapore has won election after election with, in each case, around 90% of the seats in the parliament. They have a lower proportion of votes, but the disproportional system leads to them dominating the parliament with the vast majority of the seats. There are various mechanisms which prevent any opposition really from threatening that control. There's a pretty sophisticated system for controlling the media through basically control of governing, as I understand it, the governing board that owns media companies. There's the pretense that people are free to speak their mind and oppose the government and run against the government, but we see negative consequences happening whenever anybody tries to do that. So defamation cases have been used very effectively, and in Singapore, the financial penalties for defamation judgments can be very extreme, which has led to people who criticize the regime being bankrupted in some cases, and bankruptcy is then a reason for not allowing them to run in elections. So we see really a whole set of techniques used, perhaps often first used in Singapore, which we also see then later adopted by these various other authoritarian rulers around the world. So the reason we don't think it can really be called a democracy is that it's very hard to imagine, at least up to the present. This could change, but at least up to the present, it's very hard to imagine any other party emerging and being able to seriously threaten the PAP's control at the ballot box.
And this is the answer that I was looking for, because when I went researching outside the context of the book, and I specifically looked at Lee Kuan Yew's various statements on democracy, something that kept on jumping up, and this is the model that the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, to a certain extent, Viktor Orban have used, perhaps not perfected it as Lee Kuan Yew had, to attempt to change the very definition of democracy and make it very context specific. And then it hit me that just about everybody that you talk about in the book, be it the Peruvian dictator who we are going to come to later, because Silvio Berlusconi and his control of the media empire, these are all great examples in the book. But what unites all of them together is a very interesting interpretation of history. And this is something that they perhaps lift ostensibly from dictatorships as they used to be. And you and the co-author, both of you make a very interesting point that with the emergence of more tertiary graduates, perhaps spin dictators find themselves at a crossroad where they either go full democratic or they go full old 20th century dictatorship. However, for a lot of them, including residents of Singapore, to a certain extent, residents in parts of Russia, perhaps not Moscow, but extended Russia, this conception of this long-winded theory of history has won for spin dictators an idea about their place in the world. How would you see their interpretation of democracy and history in the light of your research?
That's a very interesting question. It's true that many authoritarian leaders, as part of their rhetoric of self-justification, present a very distorted version of history. I mean, of course, democratic politicians often do this to some extent. They present a very positive view of national history, and especially of the periods in which their party was in control. But there's more distortion in the case of authoritarian leaders, in part because they can drown out or completely silence critics who point out that the history doesn't actually, or the evidence doesn't actually confirm that view of history, that things are more complicated. Is this different from the way that, so is the way that spin dictators use history different from the way that fear dictators of the 20th century, and even there are some fear dictators still, of course, is it different from the way that fear dictators use history? I think on balance, yes, because the versions of history that we encounter under fear dictators are often part of the official ideology that's imposed on citizens in fear dictatorships. So the view of history under Stalin or Khrushchev or Brezhnev was not just a particular view that emphasized certain elements that would make the current leader look good. It was consistent with a complicated and rather strange ideology that was elucidated in certain key iconic texts that the regime viewed as their justifying works, or as the source of all knowledge. So Marxism-Leninism for the Soviet regime, in regimes like Hitler's Germany, of course, Nazism and Mein Kampf were where the conception of history was developed. When we look at somebody like Putin or Orban or Hugo Chavez, of course, they have, and I'm talking now about the early Putin, because here again, we see a very stark reversion to an older model, to an archaic model in recent years. But originally, the Putin view of Russia's history was not very different from the view espoused by by democratic politicians on the more nationalist side. In fact, if you read his early speeches, there's a lot about Russia actually rejoining Europe and Russia developing as a player in the modern world among other great powers, but not essentially very different from the Western powers. Today, of course, he's completely obsessed by these odd details of the history of Russia, like in the Middle Ages. He'll go into great detail about Yaroslav the Just or Yaroslav the Wise, and who did what to whom in 1462. So that the way history has taken over Putin's consciousness is very different from the model of spin dictatorship. In other cases, Erdogan is another example of a spin dictator who does obviously justify himself in historical terms. But and thinking about Lee Kuan Yew and the Singapore leadership, I'm not sure that so there's a conception of Singapore's particular place in the world, and there's a story about Singapore's development, and there's of course attention to the geopolitical context, the external threats that existed. And there's a very strong cultural argument that people in Singapore and maybe Asians in general are different from Westerners. And that becomes a justification for having a somewhat different, as they would put it, form of democracy. But I'm not sure. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit. I'm not sure about the conception of history that's so central and so different from the mainstream spectrum of accounts of history.
So just to give you an example, we all saw, at least in my case, I was riveted by Mr. Tucker's interview of Mr. Putin. And that was a long, nightmarish interpretation of history on internet. So I think most of the facts were wrong, but because you've been given this interview as some sort of great gift, so you can't stop the man. You can't stop the person from giving wildly inaccurate personal interpretation of something which a professional historian would perhaps come and stand to ground. But on the same level, you have Mr. Viktor Orban. In fact, there is some sort of because one of the first leaders that Mr. Tucker interviewed first was Mr. Orban. I remember that he went all the way to interview him in Budapest. So even Orban went on about a specific point of time in history. And if you look at Hungary, so Hungary is a member of EU. In fact, you write about it in the book that most of the spin dictators, they become part of multilateral organizations and then make them stop because they have access to deliberative tools, which are created in spirit of democracy, but they can be abused. But if you look at Mr. Orban, and this is very interesting, Hungary is part of the Organization of Turkic States. And every year, they have this great panjandrum wherever Mr. Erdogan decides to go for perhaps winter holiday. I'm being flippant, but essentially. And Hungary is one of the only European participants. It's this idea that Hungarians have come from Turkey, the Turkish people or the Turkish races, is a largely absolutely repudiated idea in history. And yet, there are these people who are running a country. And Mr. Erdogan, the reason I'm fascinated by it is because he's funding think tanks after think tanks. They've just gotten a great show on the road in EU. So this interpretation of history becomes the standard which is then fed to people who are going to be reading these reports, because we live in the age of spin. And nobody wants to read 330, 35-page book. If I can get like a 3-minute version, I'm suddenly an expert on democracies. So that was my intent. How do you challenge it?
Well, it's obviously true that the spin dictators use history, and as in discussion of current circumstances, they distort. They don't completely reinvent the facts, but they distort them. They present them in a certain somewhat deceptive way, and they do so with a kind of usually with a kind of disregard for the need for consistency, let's say. So in Putin's early rhetoric, it's kind of a kaleidoscope of different images plucked from history that don't go together at all, but may appeal to different members of society. So there's elements of the old kind of pathos of the Soviet Union, Soviet culture. There's elements of the pre-Soviet imperial history. There's also this story about modern Russia, the post-Soviet period. So there's that kind of almost artistic reassembly of inconsistent bits and pieces from the past in order to produce this mosaic which will simultaneously appeal to a lot of different people coming from very different mental places. So that seems to us a kind of characteristic strategy or approach of spin dictators. And that's quite different from the old fear dictators who, when they had an ideology, tried to make it more consistent in general, right? Took it seriously and really emphasized key texts.
Just to kind of add to it, and it's not really a question, but this is coming again from the book. So you use the word Tsar, and essentially what the word at that point of time means when it is given to Putin. So it's kind of reimagining of a glorious time when Russia was this. Because today, what is Russia? A 10th of the United States. It used to be a 1/3 of the United States when it was Soviet Union, but today it's a 10th. And yet, it has an empire of influence, or the negative connotation of it. And Putin sits at the power center, kind of running all of this. Or if you look at the literal translation which is used in the Turkic newspapers, the word padishah is used for the president, Erdogan. So this kind of going back to a certain glorious era is what I meant by it. But you brought in ideology, and the book is great for that. Before I get into ideology and economy, I had a niggling doubt. Would you say that the end of ideology, as we understood it in terms of violent dictators, are spin dictators also able to use religion to their advantage? And this, while I was researching for it, if you look at Vladimir Putin and his usage of the Russian Orthodox Church, if you look at Erdogan and his use of political Islam, if you look at Mohammed bin Salman, who's a very interesting figure, and Mohammed bin Salman in this comes across some sort of a halfway house, neither fully there nor fully here. They're all able to use a version of religion for control, replacing ideology. So is religion also an important contributor to spin dictatorships?
I wouldn't say it's characteristic of spin dictatorships. Spin dictatorships are very varied on a lot of dimensions. So on the political spectrum, some are sort of on the right. Obviously, early Putin. You could say that the Singapore regime was rather on the right. Some are more on the left, like Hugo Chavez. If we look at religion, some of these leaders, the ones you mentioned, referenced religion a lot. Others don't. So again, I think Singapore, Fujimori in Peru, there's no particular emphasis on religion. So I think it's an element which some do use opportunistically or manipulate in some way to be part of their image, which they project, but others don't. I think, to get back to history, all rulers do tend to have a view of the past. That's part of their rhetoric and their self-justification. And I think dictators, as opposed to democrats, tend to focus more on the past. Democrats often focus more on the present and on the future. So in that sense, I think there is a commonality maybe between spin dictators and fear dictators in emphasis on the past. But in general, in their rhetoric, spin dictators try to mimic democrats. So some of them do also talk a lot about the future. And it also depends on the context. So if a ruler, a spin dictator, is ruling a religiously homogeneous society, then of course exploiting religion is a lot easier and more attractive than if he's in charge of a state that has multiple religions. So we see, for instance, in Kazakhstan, under Nursultan Nazarbayev, the former president, he had a different rhetoric when addressing Russian-speaking, ethnically Russian citizens of Kazakhstan, and when addressing Muslim, ethnically Kazakh citizens. And that's very characteristic in such settings for the leader to adopt a different, perhaps inconsistent rhetoric, set of images, way of talking when addressing different groups.
So in all of this, one of the things that in the data visualization and other things that are present in the book, you have a very interesting graph, which kind of goes back and puts it at sometime around 1980s. And most of these spin dictatorships are coming up and about. Right around the time, you also have the neoliberal consensus. And now I'm speaking as an economist, and the Washington consensus, and you have the beginnings of second generation reforms in some parts of the world and third generation economic reforms in some parts of the world. And this is the time that we see spin dictatorships really mature as an idea. I mean, before that, there were perhaps one or two, and this is what comes across very well in the book. And I think at some point of time, somebody has asked you this as well, but I think it's an important question. Did the neoliberal consensus make it easier for resource control? And it made spin dictatorships really boom. And as an example, let's take a look at Russia. So you have the tragedy of Boris Yeltsin years. You are selling nickel mine and nickel companies and petroleum companies for loose change. You have the consolidation, and then Boris Yeltsin departs. Putin comes to power, and there is that famous conversation that he has with the Krezha. I hope I'm pronouncing the Russian word right, where he tells them to step out of politics. They are no longer welcome in politics if they want to keep control of resource companies, and then you have people like Boris Berezovsky and others. So did the neoliberal consensus make it easier for spin dictatorships?
Well, we do see the emergence and the growing prevalence of spin dictatorships as being in large part a function of economic modernization. And we can debate what exactly was the relationship between the Washington Consensus and the very rapid economic development in very many parts of the world after the 1980s. So, of course, in that period, we saw dramatic increase in wealth in many countries, along with increase in inequality in many parts of the world. But what are the elements that we see as being most relevant to the emergence of spin dictatorship? Well, in part, the growth in the size of the middle class, the shift towards from industry into the knowledge economy, which makes it more costly to try and control society through heavy-handed violent repression. You have to allow ideas to circulate in order to stimulate the kind of innovation that the knowledge economy requires. Liberalization of the media, or at least growth of multiple media. And along with all this, the spread in belief in democracy and a desire on the part of this growing middle class to participate, to be represented in politics, at least to some extent. All of that, along with globalization and the growing interconnectedness of different states and societies, complicates the task of overt repression and imposing a kind of fear dictatorship, and creates the incentive for rulers to become more inventive about how they control society, and also creates the incentive to pretend to be democratic and exploit the advantages that come with that, both in terms of legitimacy at home and in terms of better international reputation and greater opportunities to attract foreign investors and forge links with Western governments and so on. So we see economic development and the associated globalization, which are of course related to the change in economic paradigm in the 1980s, 1990s. We see those as being really as laying the ground, providing the conditions in which a change in the dominant model of dictatorship emerges. But I don't know if it's really the ideas per se. It's this vast global economic and social change that has these effects in our telling of the story.
And one of the interesting characterizations of spin dictators is, and I really like the way both of you have put it, Davos men. They wear very sharp suits, and they go to Davos, and they're part of the World Economic Forum and the other conferences of this sort. And one of the things that is disconcerting in all of this is the role that knowledge consultancies provide. So, for example, large consulting outfits that worked with Russia. And after reading the book, I actually went back and I looked up, various publications from the Big Four and, McKinsey and so on and so forth, painting a picture of Russia during transformation. And the one thing that comes out on top is that Vladimir Putin, in fact, there was a time from 2001 to 2005, 6, when Putin could do no wrong. He was seen as this great transformative leader. At the same time, in fact, I'm pretty sure that Sergei Guriev, who at that point of time was leading HSE, so he would have seen the change, but alcoholism was on the rise. Mortality of young Russian men was at unheard levels because suddenly control has been taken away from you. And yet, these ranking agencies, these rating agencies, were trying to put a halo around Putin. To what extent are these international consultancies responsible for providing a platform for lack of a better word, wannabe dictators?
Okay, so I think the answer I would give to that is a bit complicated. First of all, on Russia, it actually wasn't in the 2000s under Putin that alcoholism and mortality spiked. That happened in the 1990s.
Yeltsin era, but it continued.
Well, it continued till about 2002, and then it sharply fell. So there were some reforms and there were some social changes that happened under Putin, which actually improved mortality and reduced alcoholism. There was a substitution, as often happens as the bourgeois middle class grows. There was a substitution from hard liquor, which is so extremely dangerous and binge drinking especially, to beer and wine. There was a stabilization, which contrasted with the crisis in healthcare and in the extremely high levels of stress in the 1990s. So I would say that's one part of the picture. Then why do the consultancies and part of international public opinion seem to give Putin a bit of a break in the early 2000s? Well, in part because the economy is recovering and absolutely booming from the early 2000s. And the stock market is taking off. So if we talk about the emergence of billionaires in Russia, we often mistakenly focus on the 1990s and say Yeltsin, cultivated these oligarchs. Well, some of them got their start in the 1990s, but you see billionaires emerging in the Putin years, in the early Putin years, because of this recovery of the economy, recovery in the price of oil, and surge in the Russian stock market. So it was a time when things looked to consultancy companies as though there were problems, but things were basically on a good path. And I think, yes, people neglected. I myself may have underestimated the dangers. I mean, I was very much aware of them, but underestimated the future impact of undemocratic elements in the mix at that point. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's understandable that the consultancy companies would take a line at that point, which seems very inconsistent with what came later. But I would also say that Putin's path was not predetermined, that there were various factors which, in retrospect, look much more certain than actually was the case. So in 2000, 2001, I think, and this is based on not just what he said, but also on what he was saying in private to a lot of people that I've spoken to, Putin was really open to a much more cooperative relationship with the West. And he explored that in various ways. So the Putin of 2000, 2001 seems to me it's a different person from the Putin today, but also quite different from the Putin of 2008. Now, there were a lot of things going on that we still don't fully understand. And so my view of this could be wrong. There were There was the role of the security services, which has ended up being, the dominant element in the Russian mix, which was important in the early 2000s, but much less visible and I think less important. But I have to be careful because we don't know all the facts regarding that. Still, I think the early Putin regime could have developed into something, well, which first of all could have remained a spin dictatorship rather than reverting to fear, or perhaps could have evolved into something more democratic. That would have required Putin losing power at some point or else stepping down. It seemed to me that there was a possibility in 2008 when he handed over to Dmitry Medvedev that he would feel that he was sufficiently protected, that the regime was on a good track, and that he could step back and kind of let it evolve into something more competitive. He decided against that. Obviously we know that now. But I don't think that was predetermined either. So looking at Russia, and obviously this is something that I spend a lot of time doing, it's my main focus in political analysis. But it went down one particular path. I think other paths were possible, and we have to bear that in mind when we think about what was the right way to evaluate, the early 2000s in Russia. So, I mean, that's kind of a long-winded way of responding to your question. I don't think that the consultancies were completely wrong. I think they, as consultancies are, overestimated or over-focused on the positive economic numbers. And that kind of shaped their view at that time.
So I agree with everything that you're saying. And the facts that you pointed out, you are the Russia expert, I'm not. So the 2002 one would also be correct. But I am an amateurish analyst of China. I lead research on China. And China is a fascinating country because depending on which side you take a look at it, it's either a spin dictatorship or a fair dictatorship. So it's a fascinating country. It manages to be in both the camps at the same time. But it was always not like this. 1991, 1992, you pick up Q Shailong or any of these people, and there was this idea that China is going to, at some point of time, become a democracy. Although, in fact, we have the 1996, 1997 quote from Bill Gates, where he prophesied that with the advent of new technology, it will be hard for the Communist Party of China to maintain the level of control they have over the country. 2.5 decades later, that has proven to be absolutely incorrect. But to quote Stephen Kotkin, great historian of Soviet Union, great biographer of Stalin, when they went into the archives, they realized that USSR was a communist country. So when consultancies talked about China, they often forgot that it's a communist regime. And today, I mean, now everybody has given up on China as the great hope of democracy. But now let's take a look at Vietnam. Where would you place Vietnam on your praxis of spin versus fear, considering that their president has just resigned under fairly mysterious circumstances?
So first on Vietnam, I think we classified it as maybe as a fear dictatorship, possibly as a hybrid dictatorship. And there are, of course, some cases which combine elements of overt repression with other elements that look more like spin. but there is consistent with the communist nature of the regime, there is a level of overt repression, I think, that goes beyond what's found in a spin dictatorship. But of course, it's developing and it could change. And I know very little about Vietnam, so take that into account. On China, it's a fascinating case. Obviously, it's the big conundrum. What's happening? Where's it going? And when we were writing the book, it was interesting when we talked to different people about China, and the non-China specialists said, well, clearly it's a fear dictatorship. You have large numbers of people, of political prisoners in all eras, essentially. You have forced confessions on TV of dissidents, essentially. Clearly, they're trying to send a message of intimidation against anybody who might question the party publicly. When we talked to China specialists, they said, well, it's a spin dictatorship. They focused much more on the elements of manipulation of the message, of attempt to achieve legitimacy through performing well and championing one's achievements, championing the party's achievements and modernizing China and so on. And so this seemed to them more like a spin dictatorship. And of course, some of the techniques for internet propaganda, rhetorically too, that we talked about in connection to spin dictatorships were also used in China. The view that we ended up with is that, yes, it is a fear dictatorship, and it has always been a fear dictatorship. But in the 2000s, it looked as though it might be on a path to spin dictatorship. There was a change that came in the late Hu period, and much more clearly under Shree, when they cracked down on independent media. They had actually allowed a certain level of independent media and investigative reporting in the early 2000s. But then things go into reverse, especially, as I said, with Shree. And we see this in Hong Kong, right? So it's no longer, you can sort of have a different, more liberal version in Hong Kong and a different set of practices in the mainland. So Shree has been consolidating control, and I think there's a very clear message of intimidation against people who might protest. So violent repression in Hong Kong against protesters. Of course, it's always been the case in Xinjiang and in Tibet, but those were kind of bracketed off. Now people know that they should expect a strong repressive response to any direct challenge to the party. So we see it as a fear dictatorship, as in fact we see MBS in Saudi Arabia, whom you mentioned. The level of violent repression there seems to us inconsistent with spin, although, like many modern leaders, maybe all modern leaders, there is a lot of attention to using the internet, to using persuasive techniques, as well as, in that case, repression. But when you have executions and political imprisonment and basically very heavy-handed bullying of the wealthy, arresting the billionaires to basically force them to cooperate, then that strikes us as really the old model rather than the new. Finally, you mentioned the internet and our kind of naive hopes that it would fundamentally transform dictatorships into democracies. And I was just reading a speech by President Clinton from 2000, where he talked about that China wants to control the internet. Well, good luck. It's like nailing Jello to the wall. That was a common view, right? And now we see that the internet is a complicated technology that does in some ways empower independent voices, independent citizens, but can also be used to control and repress more effectively. So the technology itself doesn't have any very clear implications for the evolution of the political system. It all depends. It can be used in different ways. But so, China, Vietnam, it looks at the moment as though it's maybe at an earlier phase along the path that China has gone down. Maybe Vietnam could evolve into a spin dictatorship, but it's also definitely possible that the leadership will at some point decide that liberalization has gone too far and it needs to regain full political control.
I have two quick questions, with your permission. One, in the book, if I'm not forgetting my facts, you talk about Silvio Berlusconi's control of 6 news media outlets, 3 that his company owned, 3 that were state-owned, and that made up for 5.5 to 7.5% of gap when other media stations came on the scene. So traditional media was very powerful and was a tool that was used by spin dictators, fear dictators ad nauseam. And then there's the example of Fujimori in Peru, who is able to control it, and then he lets go of it and then, is deposed. You also write about the Venezuelan former president Chavez, or Generalissimo Chavez, who used to do performances on television going long, very, very long time. And the great hope, as we just talked about, was this social media. In your talk and also in the book, you talk about the great opposition to Putin, that was Navalny. A lot of people started looking up to Navalny, and sadly, Navalny is no more amongst us because of them to a certain extent, I think. But what about social media and traditional media now? Newspapers are shutting down at an accelerated pace across the world. And in countries where they're not shutting down, so for example, India, 1,000 newspapers. But if you start looking at the ownership, virtually 50 companies control 1,000 newspapers of repute. I mean, if you're looking at syndication network, between 5 or 6 business families, you have 85% of the news media entirely covered. And for social media, you now have consultants who can get you likes, who can get you views, who can get you #1 politician, whatever that means. How do we vet information in this age of spin? Because it's not just spin dictators, it's also democracies that are falling by the wayside.
Wow, that's too big a question for me. I wish I knew the answer, but yeah, we're struggling with that. I think all of us. Social media, social networks can have, as for the internet in general, can have a positive effect on politics. They can also clearly have a negative effect. I think we're in a period in which social media is evolving. We're starting to recognize the negative aspects of it more and more, and that may lead to the emergence of a new system, whether it's invented by the tech companies or it's imposed by regulation. Excuse me. We may end up with more of a kind of split between different networks, some of which are more curated and others of which are free for all and full of conspiracy theories. But I don't really know how that's going to go. You're absolutely right. That's a key element of, I think, how politics takes place and how opinion is formed these days. And yeah, the model of reputable, a little bit stodgy traditional media, that's under threat. I think there will always be a demand for media one can trust. So reputation is going to remain very important. So I think and this, of course, is just my speculation, but I think the New York Times will, assuming it remains the New York Times with the same standards and values, it will remain viable, not so much because it provides all the scoops, that it publishes the news first, but because it has the reputation which allows people to believe that what they read in that source is true. And I think we will continue to have sources, outlets that play that role, that basically it's not that we necessarily go there for the news, but we go there for the news that's true. And people will continue to consume all these other sources in a way that's kind of between information, news, and entertainment. The meaning of the word believe has, I think, changed and been problematized recently, because there are so many people who say they believe things which others find it incredible that they could believe. And I think believe can mean a lot of different things. You actually think that the factual statement is true. You have a kind of an emotional connection to that statement because it feels good to say it, or something else. So there's a lot that we need to study. There's a lot we don't understand, and there's a lot that we just don't know yet, because this is a problem that's evolving. But I think the emergence of social media is part of the whole changing environment that leads to evolution of models of authoritarian politics. So it'll be part of spin dictatorship. It's also part of fear dictatorship too, to the extent that that remains in some places. But it's not possible at this point to say whether in the long run it's going to be a force for liberalization or even liberation, or a force for social control. Clearly, it can have both of those effects. And the key question is, well, which ends up being more powerful, and whether tech companies and governments develop the controls and the technologies to make these innovations more liberal rather than more illiberal.
Thank you, Professor. I have, for the last hour, been asking you very negative questions, but your book ends on a hopeful note. So why don't you give us that sort of glimmer of hope that you have for the readers, so that we can then, after that, open it up to perhaps more negative questions. But, you know, it's not all is lost.
Well, I mean, that depends on us. It's kind of conditional optimistic. In fact, it may not even be optimistic, the end point. But if you buy my argument, or our argument, that what's driving this change to a softer kind of authoritarianism, and soft is in quotation marks because, of course, spin dictatorships do horrible, covertly very repressive things. But still, they kill fewer people. They start, in general, fewer wars. They are at least somewhat constrained by the desire to project an image of democratic, benevolent leadership. So if you buy our argument that the shift to spin is driven by modernization, globalization, and the social changes that those bring about, then extrapolating, it would seem that if economic development and globalization continue, this trend towards softer regimes should also continue. But now then there's the question, well, is economic development and globalization, are they going to continue? And some people already say, well, globalization is going into reverse. We don't see that in the statistics yet, but clearly there's a plateau in the extent of global trade. There are lots of obstacles being put in the way of some global trade flows. So there's no guarantee that the world will remain as interconnected as it is today. There's also no guarantee that economic development will continue. World economic development has continued for a very long time now, with temporary depressions and reverses, but the trend has been very clear. There's no guarantee that that will continue. But still, if these social and economic processes continue, it gets harder and harder to control a country through mass overt repression. It gets harder and harder to survive in a global economy using techniques that work in an agricultural society or even a mass industrial society, but don't work in a knowledge economy. So the pressure is towards progress, but bear in mind all those caveats. We could go into a period in which basically modernization and globalization plateau, and the perception of many is that at this point we're in a democratic recession. So the pressures against democracy are much stronger than in the past, and the number of democracies may be decreasing slightly. And the same for trade, as I said, same for globalization in general. So yeah, a very conditional optimism, if you want to call it that.
Thank you. I will take the optimism as the much needed sign. Thank you so much for doing this. It has been sort of eye-opening on more than one level. The book, I think everybody now is going to go, hopefully, grab a copy, get into it. And hopefully you had fun having this conversation.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it was a great discussion. Thanks for your interest.